Well, this is unusual. It is not often that I have a guest on the program that I've met in the flesh. Not that I deliberately avoid guests, but I consider Antony Rotunno a friend, and back in 2023, we met up in London and had an all-afternoon Beatles sightseeing trip. He is the host of the long-running and much-respected podcast Glass Onion on John Lennon, now celebrating its 7th anniversary. Antony, welcome to the show.
Hello, Ghosty. This is my debut on American radio.
It is.
Yeah, just past 7 years of Glass Onion, so not a bad time to talk to you.
So we're basically celebrating Glass Onion on John Lennon today on the show, and we're going to talk about your favorite episodes, and we'll also highlight some specific songs from John Lennon that you've picked out, and we'll play them and talk about them. But before we get into any of that, I want to go back to the very beginning, because no one, as far as I know, starts a podcast out of some kind of lust for glory. It's always a void that needs to be filled, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. By the way, when you said no one, I thought you were about to say no one has heard of your podcast. So let's go back to the beginning. Well, to put it bluntly, I used to check every now and again on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it's known, and there was never a John Lennon podcast. And I think, like you, I've always been a radio fan. As a kid, I watched TV, obviously, but I was just as invested in radio as TV. And I always wanted to start a podcast, and I saw there hadn't been a John Lennon one, and to my knowledge, I don't think there's even another John Lennon one, as in sort of general. There may be ones, I think there have been series about specific parts of John Lennon's life or events. But yeah, it was just that. I always wanted to start a podcast. And as regards John Lennon, I mean, I have this origin story that I told on, I think, episode 1 of the show, and we're now 116 episodes in. And it was, I read this Ray Coleman book that's been a little bit maligned on the podcast, but I read it about 14, just couldn't put it down, and I watched the Imagine film. There's lots of films with John Lennon called Imagine, so it's the one from 1988. And also John and Yoko, A Love Story, which you know very well, for another reason. And I was just absolutely entranced by this character, and I realise now that there was definitely some post-death martyrdom and propaganda, if you want to call it that, playing up John Lennon as one particular character. And then we got the Albert Goldman biography that was very different. But yeah, to cut a long story short, that was it really. There was a gap. I never saw any John Lennon podcast out there. There weren't that many Beatles podcasts. Obviously there's now, 300 or whatever it is.
Right.
It's hard to know how many there are because I haven't heard all of them. But yeah, that was it really. And then I contacted someone who I could talk about in a minute. And when he said yes to the show, that was the final push, because I did procrastinate for a while. But yeah, that was it. Early 2019 was when I started.
It's interesting that there are so many podcasts revolving around the Beatles, and as you say, they might have a series where they talk about, the Sometime in New York City album for, well, maybe not today they don't, but, they'll pick a John Lennon album, and that'll be a series for a little while, and that's it. It is unusual that for someone as famous, and certainly as lauded, that there isn't more. But in a way, I think you'll agree with me that the fame of the Beatles just continues to swallow up any aspects of their individual solo careers.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, we did get this quote, though, didn't we, recently from Giles Martin, who's not particularly controversial as far as I can see, saying, there's not much in the vault. And I always thought the Beatles thing would just carry on, but I don't know, maybe it is on the wane a little bit. Because just to go back to the point we were making about no John Lennon podcast, I have come to realise that John Lennon and the Beatles, although they are obviously still massively significant, I thought that young people had been entranced by them now. And obviously some have, we've had some young podcasters that we know. But yeah, I don't know. I think, yeah, definitely the solo careers. I mean, John Lennon's solo career is very difficult because it wasn't very long. It was only a few albums, most of which I haven't reviewed in my 7 years. I still haven't reviewed his albums, which you think would be the most obvious thing to do. Yeah, they probably have. Obviously, Paul is still very active, and I think he's got a new album coming out this year, I believe.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, and Ringo's obviously still around, and I think George's solo career is probably not as known apart from 2 or 3 albums. So yeah, but the John Lennon thing, I mean, I'm just absolutely amazed. I mean, 7 years and 116 episodes, and some of them are 2 hours as well. So he's talking about probably done, what have I done, 200 hours, 250 hours, something like that.
Something like that. And you still haven't gotten around to doing a review.
I know, I haven't reviewed Imagine, can you believe that?
We're really selling this podcast today.
It's genuinely alternative, folks.
Yes.
But as you know, I kind of use John Lennon as a jumping off point, because I have another podcast about psychology and alternative media, and there's definitely crossover.
Well, let's talk about some of the highlights. So what would you consider over the past 7 years to be some of the more memorable shows?
Yeah, well, I've picked quite a few, so don't worry, I will be brief with these. I mean, obviously, interviewing or having discussions with people who knew him is clearly going to be one of the things. And I should mention in passing, Caitlin Hare. She lived next door to the Dakota, or 2 doors down or something. She was Sean Lennon's playmate, but unfortunately she was only 5 when John Lennon died, so she still had a few memories which I loved. But I mean, I can't not mention the 2 Quarrymen. They're the 2, maybe the only 2 who are still with us. I mentioned earlier that I contacted someone when I was procrastinating, and I said, if he says yes to being on the show, I'll do it. And that was Rod Davis, and that was my first interview. We did a couple of hours, and then a really crazy story. Colin Hanton, who's a drummer, who was actually still in the band when George joined. So you had John, Paul, George and Colin for a while. Doesn't have the same ring, does it? He still lives in the what's broadly called the Penny Lane area of Liverpool. And I went there in I think it was early 2020, just before COVID, in fact. And Colin had played on these amazing recordings from 1958. That'll be the day, and In Spite of All the Danger. Apart from the Church Fate recording, won't go into that now. They're more or less the first recordings of the Beatles. And we now know the date of those, and it happens to be, I think it's 3 days before John Lennon's mother was killed, which is incredible. But one of the reasons that researchers were able to confirm the date was because Colin Hanton said it was definitely a Saturday because I was meeting my new girlfriend that day. Okay, so this is July 1958. So I'm in Colin Hanton's house, we're having a nice time, having a chat. And then we hear the key go, and his wife comes home, and it's the same woman that he was meeting in July 1958. And this is, what would that be, 61 and a half years later. So that was amazing. And then just very quickly, Dan Richter was actually Moonwatcher in 2001: A Space Odyssey. He's the guy who throws the bone in the air for the famous 2 million year jump cut, or whatever it is. Not only did he work with Kubrick, he was assistant to John Yoko. And I remember very well the day I talked to him, because I was teaching. It was scorching heat in Madrid. I was recording an album, and by the time I got to actually talk to Dan, I hadn't been able to make any notes at all. And we talked for 2 hours straight without notes. And I'm not saying that to big myself up. It's just it just flowed. And obviously I talked to him about Stanley Kubrick. This is what I'm talking about. The podcast is not, I'm not rooted to just talking about John Lennon. If I get a guy who's worked with Stanley Kubrick and I love Stanley Kubrick, I'm going to talk to him about that. So, and then there was a Revolution 9 episode, which is one of the solo ones I did. And I've always found Revolution 9 very spooky, and I actually love it. I actually think it's amazing. And I recorded that, I finished about 2 a.m, and that was the first time I ever really personalised. And that's become a hallmark of the show, you know. As I'm sure you'd agree, you know, things like podcasts, it's very cathartic. You know, you can talk about your own life and people seem to be interested. And then you and I, just one more, you and I, we did a show about John Lennon and Elvis, which turned out to be a lot about Elvis. And we discovered our casual chemistry, was the phrase we came up with.
That's right.
And I'm not just saying this because on your show, but, you know, you and I do have a certain chemistry, and we've had some epic talks, you know, on film stars as well, Orson Welles, Marlon Brando. So there's loads of others. They're just a few that come to mind, basically.
Yes, we have, and listeners could go and find those conversations that we had on YouTube, because I think of them as more confessionals than I do. You know, obviously you mentioned COVID. I could get into that, but
no, please don't.
But let's talk for a moment about the Woolton Village Fete. And for people who are listening to this and don't know, John Lennon and the Quarrymen performed at the Village Fete where he met Paul. And certainly you've talked about it quite a bit on the podcast, that there is almost this kind of, I mean, it goes beyond serendipity. It's something supernatural about all of these incredibly important moments that seemingly were not important at the time, but have since somehow been found to have been captured on tape or recording. All of these historical events documented, and it seems to run right through the Beatles story right from the very beginning. That a tape of that Village Fete exists.
That will always be my favourite Beatles recording, and if I think I've used the word supernatural, it's just absolutely crazy. Because I mean, if you think about it, so say there was a Village Fete in Liverpool this Saturday, 2026. Someone might record it on their phone, but it's not that likely that people would actually record the show. And I think they recorded the whole show, probably one set, perhaps. Let's say there was half an hour out there. But this is 1957. It's in what's essentially a village. I mean, Woolton was really a village within a city. It's quite a kind of middle class, I'd probably call it, area of Liverpool. And yeah, John, as you said, played with the Quarrymen. He played on the field at this fete. Paul McCartney was there. They met between sets, and then they played this evening show, and someone recorded it on one of those amazingly clunky, reel-to-reel tape recorders. I mean, I thought the ones we had in the 80s were primitive, but this is the mid-50s or 57, and it was recorded, and it was just absolutely amazing. And one thing we've been talking about a bit on the show is, should we clean up those recordings? And my natural answer is to say no, it has to sound primitive, and maybe you could clean it up so it's just a tiny bit more listenable. But as you said, there's all kinds of things in the Beatles world where you do get these weird coincidences. And I mean, the fact that John Lennon made his first recording 3 days before his mother died is pretty strange as well. But there's probably about another 100 of those, strange things.
Well, since we're already kind of talking about favorite recordings, why don't we just segue into the 3 John Lennon songs that I asked you to pick out to play on the show today.
Right. Can I cheat and do 3.5 songs?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to have an honourable mention of Imagine. It's not one of my 3 songs, but
okay.
It's one of those songs, it's so hard to compare. When someone said, how does Imagine compare to other John Lennon songs? Because we've heard it so many times, it's very difficult to compare. But really, I just want to make the point that it was apparently voted Song of the Century at Millennium Time. And really, it's interesting that a song that's so simple, like musically and lyrically, has caught on. People, of course, point to the possessions line, imagine no possessions, and the idea that it's slightly communist or globalist. But a question I could leave hanging is, would John Lennon have continued to play this had he lived post-1980 and become a touring musician? Anyway, that's not one of my songs.
All right, well, let's get into one of your actual songs, either Beatles or solo.
Okay, I've picked, I could have picked Strawberry Fields Forever, that would be an obvious one from 67, but from the same year, I Am the Walrus. So it was inspired, 2 main inspirations, a letter John Lennon got from a Quarry Bank pupil, Quarry Bank was his grammar school, who told John in the letter that they'd started analysing his lyrics, and it brought to mind a song that had yellow matter custard in it, dripping from I don't know if it was dripping from a dead dog's eye, it was something similar. So there was that, and then there was a story from the Alice in Wonderland books called The Walrus and the Carpenter. Now, one of the reasons I love this song, it's very similar to the spirit of John Lennon's 2 books. So In His Own Right came out in 64 and Splendid in the Works. And it still blows my mind that they came out at the height of Beatlemania, which is the height of lovable, cheeky, sexless bop tops. If people had actually properly analysed the books that came out, the bubble might have burst a bit quicker. But those books are kind of the essence of John Lennon, and this is possibly the closest he ever got to a song in very much the same spirit. Now, as regards the lyrics, they appear to be nonsense. So you've got Craballock a Fishwife, Elementary Penguin and other ones, and they trip off the tongue, and they're very Alice in Wonderland. They just have a nice sound when they're sung, but they have a nice thing about them. But then you've got Semolina Pilchard, which now a lot of people, including myself, think is probably a reference to Sergeant Norman Pilcher, who was the one who was busting all these rock stars, so Donovan, then the Stones, and then John Lennon, and then George Harrison. There's some interesting stuff going on musically, and also he's got this vocal which was very treated. As you know, he said to George Martin, smother my voice in tomato ketchup, I don't like my raw voice. So he's really spitting these lyrics out, but then you suddenly get to the bit where he's saying, I'm crying, and he suddenly sounds vulnerable, and that's one of the John Lennon traits, this kind of link to childhood, or sounding sometimes like a little boy. And this was recorded just a week after Brian Epstein had died. Epstein, sorry, for your American audience. You can see all our shared histories coming out, but your audience won't be aware of it.
That's true.
Yeah, but yeah, just that one really, and then just these great lyrics like sitting in an English garden waiting for the sun. If the sun don't come, you get a tan from standing in the English rain. I mean, what the hell does that mean? But it's something about English rain. He liked doing songs about weather. Bob Dylan also put a lot of references to weather. So it's just a whole package. I just absolutely love it. And it seems, when you hear it now, it seems to make sense. But I think it was Jeff Emmerich in his book said, when John came with this weird song that didn't seem to have any rhythm or the way he played it, we take it for granted now that these things don't seem so strange. But you've got to go back to 67 when rock and roll was not very old. So, yeah, that's one of my choices.
If I'm not mistaken, I know I read this in some book somewhere, that the opening was inspired by hearing a police siren.
Absolutely.
Right. So,
while on an acid trip. So,
right.
Yeah.
So it was reverberating.
Yeah.
All right, let's go with song number 2.
Okay, well, this is a sort of 2-in-1, but I'm going to say Mother/My Mummy's Dead, but mostly Mother, because My Mummy's Dead is very, very short. So John Lennon has obviously been defined. I mean, we're all defined by our childhoods, but he seems to have been defined in the image, as I said, post-1980, as so much a product of a wounded childhood that you almost can't get away from that if you spend enough time reading about John Lennon or listening to all those great podcasts. Hint, hint. I love the Plastic Ono Band album, which came out in 1970, and there's an interesting thing that John Lennon went for primal therapy, as we know. He read this book by Arthur Yanov called The Primal Scream, which was actually mailed to him by Yanov. What basically happened, this is a very simple version, they got past the stage where they opened up all John's wounds, and presumably Yoko's, but for various reasons to do with his life and to do with custody of Yoko and not being able to get into the United States, he didn't finish the therapy. So he was opened up, but there was no closure. But you have to think to yourself, we would perhaps hope that John Lennon had finished that therapy for his sake, but for our sakes, we got this amazing album plus this very, very provocative interview he did at the same time.
Right.
But yes, Mother was the opening song on the album. Musically, it's very, very simple. It's 3 chords. The melody doesn't go anywhere. It's naked. It's raw. I actually heard some podcasters saying you can't listen to Plastic Ono Band for pleasure. Well, I actually can. I mean, I listen to it all the time. And I do get pleasure out of it, but I also get this, it's like a cathartic thing just to listen to. And this song is so simple, and he starts screaming at the end, and another debate you could have about John and Yoko. Is it honest or is it self-indulgent? Or is it both? Does it inspire other people? Is it helping other people? And I believe it probably is. And then you've got My Mummy's Dead, which is absolutely incredible. It's recorded very lo-fi. It sounds a little bit like The Village Fate, in fact, as lo-fi as that. He's using the nursery rhyme 3 Blind Mice, which spawned All You Need Is Love, Instant Karma, and My Mummy's Dead, probably others as well. So you've got the link to childhood again. And My Mummy's Dead is incredibly raw. Is it honest or self-indulgent? Can I throw a question back at you?
Well, it's interesting because the way it's recorded and everything, it's very performative. I mean, it's not honest in the sense that he just happened to be playing it and somebody walked up with a small recorder and captured it, and then we put it on the album. I mean, it was designed sonically to sound as if something he might have recorded on a home recording machine when he was a teenager, right? I mean, was that the...
I'm not sure he ever gave a reason, but I intuited it the very first time I heard it, was when I was about 14. I intuited it has to be lo-fi because it can't sound slick, because it's just got to sound raw and naked, and it would perhaps sound strange if it sounded really hi-fi. I think it has to be lo-fi because it's him just stripped to the bone. It's right at the end of the album as well, because obviously you can't follow that with some jolly love song, or not. There's any jolly love songs on that album, but you know what I mean. But yeah, I think and you're right. I mean, even with Mother, obviously he knows what he's doing. He's written the song. It's not coming out spontaneously. But then, he's got a career to think about. It'd be lovely if he could just do everything he wanted, which he arguably did at various times. But yeah, I still give him credit. I mean, I think as an artist, he had a strong sense of the artist as performing a role in society. So I like to think he was consciously thinking, well, this is very cathartic for me, but this might help other people.
Yeah.
I want to think that. Anyway.
No, I think that's true. So that was your song and a half. So let's move on to your final song on our lightning round. I feel like I'm hosting a game show. And what would be your final song, Anthony?
Beep. Yes. Right. Well, what I tried to do with these 3 songs that sort of became 5 songs, but with the 3 main songs, I tried to pick different eras. So I could easily have picked 3 from Plastic Ono Band, but I thought I'd pick one from Double Fantasy, which is really half a John Lennon album, because obviously half of it's Yoko. And I went for Watching the Wheels. So just a very bare history of this. It's a song... He was writing a lot of fragments in this 5 years where he was supposed to be doing no music. I think that's been thoroughly debunked. So it came from other songs. It was a medley at one point, but it's a song called Watching the Wheels. And it's all about the 5 years where he's away. And the chorus is saying, I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round. Now, when he recorded it, Double Fantasy came out in, I think it was October, maybe even November. And of course, he died on December the 8th, 1980. So all these songs have an added poignancy. You almost can't judge them within a vacuum anymore. John Lennon was basically both insanely productive and quite lazy at the same time, which sort of brings to mind a quote from Orson Welles, who we've talked about, who said to Michael Parkinson, something like, the reason I'm so productive is otherwise I wouldn't do anything. Otherwise I'd lie in a hammock for the rest of my life. I'm paraphrasing.
Right.
But it's this thing about being productive and lazy at the same time. And I could very much imagine John Lennon sitting watching some wheels go round, or something like that. It also calls to mind someone else we've talked about, Marlon Brando. When Marlon Brando was away for 9 or 10 years, which is basically most of the 80s, he did an interview with Connie Chung in 1989, which you and I have talked about. Right. I watched that when I was about 14, had a massive effect on me. Haven't forgotten still 5 or 6 things he said. And unfortunately, I didn't listen back. I was going to try and find his exact words, but he said something about watching ants climbing up a wall or something like that.
Yes.
Something like that. And Connie Chung's like, what are you talking about? You haven't spent 10 years watching ants. And it's like, well, obviously not. But you can see the kinship there. This ability, like John Lennon was productive, Brando was obviously productive at certain times, but they've got this ability to just sit there and just watch the world go by, and they're quite happy to do that. And in John Lennon's case, marijuana could be involved, because if you smoke a joint, it's pretty conducive to sitting in a hammock watching wheels go round, or ants. But it was also a meditation thing, focusing on one object. And it happens to be a really good song. And the lyrics mention no longer riding on the merry-go-round, which is another childhood reference, probably semi-intentional. So yeah, I mean, why does our society, here's my profound thought for the day, why does our society always have to be in motion? Why are we just always really pleased when people are doing stuff the whole time? We need to spend more time sitting. There's one of the millions of self-help books I've read, or self-development, sorry, I'll make a distinction, says sometimes the most productive thing you can do is relax. So I'll leave you with that one.
Just very briefly, I want to talk about this idea of the Double Fantasy album being overproduced. I keep hearing this, and I think it's gotten so way out of whack. People talk about it as if it's a Duran Duran album or something, and it is not. It is not thundering drums like on the Wild Boys or something like that. What's your feeling on the production of Double Fantasy?
Well, I've got to be honest. I had Ken Womack on a number of years ago. He's a well-known Beatles author, and he was making a case that it was, I don't know if he said perfectly produced, but absolutely needed to be like that. I just can't get around the fact that in 2010, when Double Fantasy Stripped Down came out, I just heard these songs a completely different way. And I went back a few months ago, and I still feel more or less the same. There's one song that I do differ with most people in terms of, he recorded I'm Losing You with a couple of members of Cheap Trick.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, oh, they should have put the Cheap Trick version. I don't really like that version. It sounds a bit too loose. And maybe they would have developed it, of course. But broadly, I would probably have to say, I think it is a bit overproduced. But, that's only my opinion. Just because when you hear the stripped down one, it just excites me much more than the finished album. Also, if you know the book Lennonology by Chip Madinger, I keep meaning to buy it, but it's always about $100 or something like that. He put the PDF online, and I actually used it for a show I did about 1975, and I read the 1980 entries from Lennonology, and the amount of mixing that went into that album is quite incredible. I mean, he was having, or maybe it was Walking on Thin Ice, but they were having something like 24-hour, 36-hour mixing sessions, almost solely for Walking on Thin Ice, which wasn't on Double Fantasy, but they were in that mode of just keep working it and working it and working it. But I don't hear it, I still like the album, but I'd probably go on the side of that, yeah.
So, as we leave you, Antony, where can people go to find 7 years worth of Glass Onion on John Lennon? And your other podcasts, might as well plug them too.
Yes. There is a website, glassoniononjohnlennon.com, and it can basically be found in all the usual places, so iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, etc. Glass Onion on John Lennon. Then the other ones are Film Gold, as you said, tend towards, I love the New Hollywood period, and obviously we've done Orson Welles, did a 5-parter on Citizen Kane, after the 3-parter that you and I did. And then Life and Life Only is the one that possibly will be the last man standing eventually, because it's so difficult juggling 3 podcasts. They almost cancel each other out in terms of how quickly I can get the shows out, if you know what I mean. But yeah, Life and Life Only is a podcast about life. It's a search for inner and outer truth. That's what it says on the tin anyway. And that will never end. As long as I'm alive, Life and Life Only will exist, right? Because that's a never-ending search, obviously. It tends towards life coaching on the one side, the sort of inner truth, self-development, and then alternative media. And I don't really do political shows as such, but I mean, I did a reading of War is a Racket, which was written probably 100 years ago, I think.
Right.
But yeah, that's the 3 shows, and they'll generally be found in all the usual places.
Thanks, Antony, and we will talk soon.
Thank you very much.